There we go. Let's get this thing started. Hey, true believers, Englentine here with a blacked out LK. What's up?
Hey. What's going on?
Oh, not much of nothing, man. Hanging out with the
Alright.
nieces, just chilling, and ran into this whole Twitter thread, whatever they call it. They're not even calling it Twitter anymore. Does anybody call it X?
Some people are. It's slowly gaining acceptance.
Then it's like, what do you call? Everybody's used to. Well, I twittered them, I tweeted them, or something like that. Nobody knows. I X them. It's like, okay, well, I don't know. I don't care.
Yeah.
So anyway, I ran across this thread, and it was this guy saying, "Woo! I'm all excited about this book coming out," and an older artist, Fabian Nietzsche, kind of called these guys out, called Marvel out for the advertisement, and it kind of clicked. I was like, holy crap, this is something that we talked about a little bit ago when DC Comics did something similar with a title, Young Justice. Let me share this thing out here, and we'll show you. We're talking about this. They got a new Night Thrasher comic book coming out. See if I've got the right one here. And this is the Night Thrasher comic.
Yeah. So I saw the solicit. I think last month. Yeah. And then just kind of rolled my eyes at it. Because again, I mean, shocker. I mean, Jay Holtham, African American guy. So of course Marvel, pigeonholes it.
No, you're black. You got to write the black guy. Basically, that's what they do now. They don't want to be racist, so they pigeonhole all writers into whatever they are.
And I mean, and honestly, the pitch didn't sound that interesting. Let me see if I can find it here.
Yep. So yeah, I saw this, and it says Night Thrasher. It's got Jay Holtham and all that kind of stuff in the names, but then on the bottom it says he's leaving the 90s behind. And Fabian Nietzsche says, "Can I ask Marvel a question? As former advertising manager who made your house ads, what the is that copy line supposed to mean? You profit every day from work done in the 90s. The character is wearing almost exactly what he wore in the original series in the 90s. Do better." And he's right. Yeah. The only thing that's missing is wasn't there a skateboard?
Yeah, he had a skateboard in his early beginnings, but it kind of, I think, then turned into sort of a hoverboard, type thing. But I honestly was not reading a ton of New Warriors, so you would need who is it? Was it Pixel or Zach that was
Zach who was big into
Zach's a huge New Warriors fan.
Yeah. So
yeah.
People kind of went off. They're not 100% behind Nietzsche on this. I am. Where they're saying maybe you left the skateboard behind. Nietzsche's saying, "Shut up." Rollerblades built in the armor. Gee, Iron Man. Anybody with the roller skates? Maybe a hoverboard, Segway.
Yeah, that's where I found some of his responses odd. I mean, the initial post is 100% correct. It's what marketing. Again, this is one of those things where, again, at beers at the local bistro or wherever these little progressive snobs go to drink.
Hold on just a second, Dalton. Hey, can you jump in here real quick? Love to get your take. Also, I had onions, and I think I'm about to throw up.
Terrific.
Yeah, it just freaking hit. So, Dalton, can you jump in and take this because I am about to be violently ill.
Okay. Well, I can. Well, here. Why don't you go? Why don't you go be violently ill? So I can tell you. So here's the overview. For anybody out there, you can decide if this book sounds interesting to you. So it's the death of a loved one draws Dwayne Taylor back to New York City, though his days as Night Thrasher are long over. But Dwayne finds the past difficult to outrun when Silhouette, his ex-teammate from the New Warrior, seeks his help against a new criminal called the OG. And the mystery of OG's true identity and what's to come will change Night Thrasher's legacy forever. So here again, something is going to happen that's going to change his legacy forever. So And they even had it in.
I'm sending him the link to give you back up, and he can take care of everything behind the scenes.
Yeah, but they've had this thing here, in the solicitude. Don't miss this bold new direction for a cult classic character who is leaving the 90s behind him. So they've been honestly advertising it, at least in the solicits. But again, most people don't read or pay attention to the solicits. So I will see. I mean, but again, this is the person that they've put on this book has very limited credits. He did a Star Trek one-off at IDW. Shocker. He's been in the Marvel Voices because, as I said, hey, it's a black character, therefore they have to hire an African American to write the character. He did that Bishop War College book this year, which I don't think was very good either. So it doesn't shock me at all in terms of what this book is, who's hired to write it, all the other creations. So, hey, MK, it's an Arkansas hat. Kind of looks like Alabama, but it's not. So again, Fabian, rightfully kind of went off, this evening. I think the better post here came from Perch. And let me see here if I can share that. Yeah.
Okay, so I take it E is taking care of his
apparently
issues.
So. Yeah. So I don't know. Let me know out there if you can see this or not, or if it's what have you. But Perch, basically responded saying, this is some baffling marketing. Fabian is dead on point. Hating on an era that made you money, and you're making money from today, including from this various title, is beyond absurd. Who do you think the market is for this book?
As I jokingly intoned in the chat, the writer goes, I want the 90s left behind me, and the fans go, but the 90s were better though. Because that's the thing. It's not just that the 90s are equally good to now. Many people look back on the 90s now as if it were some kind of golden age, because comparatively it very much kind of was. And that's a lot of this is, I think, the writers saying, because I grew out of who I was in the 90s, you all as the fans are obliged to grow out of the 90s. Even though the rest of us fans can look at it and go, okay, but you were a better and more salient creative in the 90s, and you should not have grown out of it. Maybe you just grew old rather than growing up.
Yeah. Well, and again, too, it becomes a lot of revisionist history. Because, yes, were there problems in the 90s? Of course. Were there bad books in the 90s? Sure. But there's a heck of a lot of good things in the 90s. It created a whole generation of comic book fans.
And here's the other interesting thing about even the bad stuff in the 90s. For as bad and as gonzo as some of the extremeness of the 90s was, the Rob Liefeld, the Jared Stevens Dr. Fate, for as much as I hate it, the badness in the 90s at least showed some kind of effort and was good enough in a kind of gonzo so bad it's good way that we can have nostalgia for it. I very highly doubt that unless the artistic milieu gets worse than it currently is, that we'll actually look back on All New, All Different Marvel or, DC after about the first 6 months of Rebirth with any kind of fondness whatsoever. Whereas even now, we can look back on Rob Liefeld and go, oh, Rob, oh, you crazy pouch putting everywhere son of a bitch.
Yeah, well, I mean, and here's the thing. If the 90s are so bad, why has Marvel systematically over the last several years been bringing back old creators to write books that fill in gaps or take place between classic stories that happened in the late 80s and the 90s?
Because they simultaneously need the goodwill of the 90s, while simultaneously, again, I think there is this sort of very hipsterific or very self-loathing sense of a lot of people, and even the really great writers, look back on where they were in the 90s and cringe, or they are ashamed of themselves for being so anti-establishment. It's something I've noticed a lot with Neil Gaiman, especially recently. Every time he is given an excuse to revisit something that made his career, namely, the part that I paid the most attention to, probably Sandman, but it was true also of the creative input he had in American Gods. Every new aspect of creative input he gives makes something that was good back in the day orders of magnitude worse, or he removes something from that work that made it special. And he thinks he's improving on it, when in actuality, all that happened was Neil Gaiman of 2023 is a bitter, cynical old man who no longer resembles the hungry artist with something to prove, and was, anti-establishment and irreverent in the 90s and, the late 80s and early 90s. And the world is poorer for it, because all of these countercultural mindsets that led to some of this great work are now either the establishment itself or managed to cuck out to the establishment. And they can't see how they've gotten worse rather than better over time.
Yeah, well, again, it's this duplicity that we see in much of pop culture, certainly among, I'll call them, for lack of a term, these elites, where, yes, nerdom became popular and it became the basis for all these billion-dollar corporations and enterprises. But then at the same time, they're ashamed for, we'll call them, their nerd roots from the 90s or the 80s or the early 2000s. And so it's simultaneously, yes, I'm hip and I, am a big nerd, but the stuff that I did in the 90s, that you don't want to look at that. That's really bad and it's not right, and we've got to change it. And that just drives me nuts.
It's because the ethos has shifted. Back then, the force that underpinned most of the establishment was the evangelical family values types, and so a lot of these creatives came in under the auspices of like the anti-establishment, very left-wing punk and goth movements. Whereas now, because they won the argument, because the left-wing side of the political spectrum basically won that argument, they now refuse to tell the difference between the punk movement, the irreverent attitude, the Daria-ism of the 80s and the 80s through the 90s. It's how what's his name, Rich Johnston, can look at 90s Vertigo and go, Vertigo was always about social justice, and now even people like Neil Gaiman are parroting that exact same line, because they literally can't tell the difference between the irreverence, the anti-establishment impulse that they had in their 20s, and the moralistic pompousness that they have now.
Yeah, well, so I like to say I feel like I've always been on counterculture and the punk, even though I'm Mr. Conservative here. So
I'm the same way. I haven't moved. My general stance is still screw the establishment, but that screw the establishment doesn't automatically become yay the establishment when the people that I side with are in the establishment. The establishment is still a bad thing, in my opinion.
When it was the PMRC and such, we were still, screw the government, screw that kind of stuff. Now we're just, it's the same stuff we were talking about 30 years ago. It's just the different side of the political spectrum. As far as the X-Men thing is concerned, Tom Brevoort came out, and you hear people say this all the time. Oh, the X-Men were always SJW. They weren't. And it's their misunderstanding of SJW. They thought they would take the term. Oh, it's our term. We can define what it is. And they defined it as somebody who stands for justice, not social justice, by the way, even though social is in the word. Listen to what they say. And it's like, oh, we got a black person in the comic. We made a white character black, and therefore we are good people. We are standing for social justice. Which,
funnily enough, is exactly what
hold on just a sec.
Sorry.
they have misinterpreted it just to mean justice in their eyes, instead of a social justice warrior being somebody who only sees people through the eyes of their immutable characteristics.
Well, it's, as I was saying, it's funny because that's exactly what the evangelical right wing did back in the day. We define ourselves as an incontrovertibly good thing, and therefore you can't possibly disagree with us. We speak for family values. They speak for social justice, yada, yada, yada. It's I win the argument because I call myself a good euphemism, and therefore any criticism leveled at me can actually be leveled at the thing that everyone agrees is good by definition.
Yep. If you are against us, you are one of the bad ones. That is what it all ends up being. So.
And it was exactly what they used to call out the evangelical right wing for doing, and now they find themselves doing it anyway. And it's like, okay, either I misunderstood something all along, or you guys have shifted.
Yeah.
By the way, thank you for taking the topic. I don't know what you guys talked about before, but I also wanted to point out that this is not new. They did this to Young Justice, where they were just absolutely trashing the original Young Justice in the 1990s. And they were talking about how misogynistic, how racist the 90s were. These idiots, who some of them have lived through that time period, are acting like the 1800s were the 1970s, the 1960s, the 1990s. It's amazing to me that these people who were there are willing to jump on the bandwagon and say, no, everything was horrible back then. The 90s, of course, because it was the bad girl era, excuse me. And they point to that and go, "Oh, it was the most misogynistic time in comics." It's ridiculous.
Which I call absolute bullshit on, because Neil, you answered to Karen Berger as your editor for the entirety of your run of Sandman. Screw yourself.
Well, I just point out, Jeanette Kahn saved DC Comics. We know this. Mm-hmm. We respect this. Yet modern day, at the same time, they will respect and talk about Jeanette Kahn. They'll tell you that there was absolutely no women working in comics, and if they were working in comics, they were making 50 cents on the dollar, and they needed to do the dishes in the break room.
Lies.
Instead of, there were actually some powerful women in comics back in the day, and there's some of them grew into the most respected women in the industry, much less just this one. I don't know anybody who would say a bad thing about Louise Simonson. I don't know anybody who'd say a bad thing about Ann Nesente. I think the worst thing you would say about her is the same thing you'd say about Gail Simone. She was better then than she is now.
Yeah.
She wrote better women when she wasn't forced to write women.
Well, it's something that I alluded to earlier, the idea that they define selling out as growing up, and therefore they can no longer see the difference between them in their 20s when they were irreverent, anti-establishment, fresh out of college kids, versus now when they're bitter, cynical, middle-aged, has-beens.
Yeah. We've seen it over. We've seen it over. We've seen it over. We've seen it over. And now we're finally getting some older comic book artists and writers who are seeing it as well. Now, the worst thing anybody could do, and I'm sure there's going to be some black pills that are going to jump all over it, Fabian Nietzsche's Comicsgate, some stupid thing like that. It's going to chase them away, because God forbid you shine a mirror on them and tell them that they are following OGCG.
Mm-hmm. Welcome to the party, pal.
Because nobody but me seems to be making the distinction that no, when people are talking about CG in a horrible way, they're talking about modern CG. Even though we had our troubles with OGCG, it's just we were about the readers, and now they're about the creators, and they do that by they need the us versus them to sell the books.
Yeah. Well, what's funny is I know that Fabian was going off against Comicsgate or Ethan some damn thing last month, I think.
Yeah.
So he was out there, virtue signaling. And now he has run afoul, or he will soon run afoul of his allies and his so-called friends, and he'll see just how many people are actually willing to step up to him.
Yeah, for certain people, they'll realize what the message has been all along. Like the Chuck Dixons realized, okay, we know what the battle is. Mike Baron knew what the battle was. You get some comic book creators who do not understand what the fight really was, and these are the ones that heard us say stuff like, you'll hear you'll hear people like me and Doug. We would have said Ironheart deserves her own book. She doesn't need to be Iron Man. And then you hear some people say, yeah, they replaced Iron Man with a black girl. And all they heard was they don't like black people. And this is the Fabian Nietzsche's of the world. So they didn't pay attention to what the actual message was. So occasionally they step out and they actually go, oh, wow, I just discovered this thing that those people over there had been talking about forever and a day, but I'm not going to give them credit.
Well, it's also because they strawmanned the crap out of us and made us sound like the devil at every conceivable opportunity.
Yeah. Yep. So to Helium